Today we're going to look at how the RG35XX compares to the Miyoo Mini. Now the RG35XX is running completely stock as it came delivered. With the Miyoo Mini, however, I have installed Onion OS, and the reason I'm still running with this is because this is one of the most popular builds for the Miyoo Mini. Now for all my casual gamers out there, you do know I like to do out of the box comparisons. And yes, I am running a custom OS on the Miyoo Mini. However, the emulation improvements that Onion OS adds to the system is negligible, and for me, it's more just user experience. So therefore, this comparison is still going to give you a representative idea of how these two devices compare out of the box. Starting off with PS1 emulation, both of these systems are really capable when it comes to emulating the PlayStation 1 console. Looking at Tekken 3 here, you can see both devices are running this really smoothly and comfortably, giving you a fully playable experience. This is one of the things I love about both of these devices, and something that surprised me about them as well, how enjoyable PlayStation 1 games are on a device like this with the form factor that it is. Moving on to one of my favorite games on these systems, and that is Gran Turismo, and you can see Gran Turismo is running beautifully again on both devices. The RG35XX has come out as a direct competitor to the Miyoo Mini, so there's no surprise to see that it runs these games just as smoothly as the Miyoo Mini does. The Miyoo Mini was already doing a fantastic job, so the RG35XX had to match that. The one thing that I will say is that the bigger size of the 35XX makes it a little bit more comfortable trying to control the cars in Gran Turismo, giving you a little bit more space for your thumbs to move around and not feel so cramped. Moving on to Marvel vs. Capcom, and once again you can see both of these devices are handling this game no problem whatsoever, making for a thoroughly enjoyable experience. Fighting games handle surprisingly well on both of these devices, and I think these are the perfect kinds of games on the PlayStation for this device because of the use of the D-pad instead of the analog sticks. Moving on, however, to Tenchu Stealth Assassins, and the emulation on both of these devices is absolutely brilliant. They both run the game with no issues whatsoever. However, the problem we find with a game like Tenchu Stealth Assassins starts to show the limitations of a device with this kind of form factor. Having no analog sticks means it's incredibly difficult to get a good representation and view around your character, something that's essential for a stealth game like this. So although yes, you can play Tenchu Stealth Assassins on both these devices and the emulation will be pretty much perfect, this is not the type of game I would play on the 35XX or the Miyoo Mini because it really needs those analog sticks. Now moving on to the Game Boy Advance and Pokemon Emerald, and you will see that the game is running slower on the Miyoo Mini. Now this isn't a fully direct comparison because there was an issue trying to load the game using the standard emulator in Onion OS, meaning I had to go through RetroArch, use a different emulator which just wasn't as efficient. Now although in emulation terms this isn't a fair comparison because it's different kinds of emulators, I thought this would be interesting putting this into the episode because it highlights the issue I originally had just trying to run Pokemon Emerald through Onion OS. Moving on to Tekken Advance, and now we're back to a fair comparison, both games running through the emulator delivered with the OS. And as you can see, once again, both the Miyoo Mini and the RG35XX are handling this Game Boy Advance perfectly. No issues whatsoever, both smooth, both fun to play, both giving you a great experience. On to Crash Nitro Kart, and it's more of the same. And I always find racing games like this are really interesting for these kind of emulation comparisons because the timers can show you whether there's any slowdown. And as you can see, the time's ticking away pretty much exactly the same, meaning that both emulators are running at the same speed, handling this game at the same frames per second. Now, as we would hope, games all the way up to the Game Boy Advance generation are running really well on both these devices, and this is what's brilliant about the RG35X and the Miyoo Mini. Both of these devices are tailored to play exactly the systems they come with perfectly. They're not trying to push things too far, they're not trying to do more than they can achieve, meaning that the emulation you get on these devices is near perfect, and one of the best experiences I've ever had in any retro emulation handheld. Moving on to Wario Land 4, and once again, a fantastic experience on both devices, and you might start asking the question, what's the point in doing this comparison if they're both just running all these games near perfect? Well, firstly, I wasn't sure that was going to be the case, but secondly, it's also interesting to see that considering these devices are running the games so well, how fun the games are to play on the devices, and whether the difference in form factors makes any difference to the gameplay experience, with the Miyoo Mini being much smaller than the RG35XX. Moving on to the SNES and Donkey Kong Country, once again a thoroughly enjoyable experience on both these devices. And while this runs in the background, I want to take this opportunity to discuss what I did find the differences were between these two consoles, which is focused entirely around the controls and how comfortable they are to play the games. Any games like the Game Boy Advance, SNES, Mega Drive, etc. all were really comfortable to play and I didn't really have any issues. The differences for me started when it came to using the shoulder buttons, specifically talking about PlayStation 1 games, and when it came to scenarios where you had to press the shoulder buttons as well as using the face buttons as well, the Miyoo Mini was incredibly difficult to be able to perform both of those actions, whereas the RG35XX with the extra size, it was a lot more comfortable and natural, and with the style of the buttons, with the rear buttons protruding, made it a much more comfortable experience. Now we will go into a lot more detail on this when I compare the two devices and all of their features as well, because where the RG35XX stands out in terms of comfortable controls, the Miyoo Mini also stands out in other areas. But getting back to the emulation, and we can see the 16-bit generation is handled with no issues on the Miyoo Mini and the RG35XX, with both SNES games and Mega Drive games being handled without any issues whatsoever. So when it comes to emulation of devices all the way up to the PlayStation 1 generation, you can't really go wrong with either of these two devices. However, there are some significant differences between the two, which you might want to consider if you come in to decide which one to buy, which we will discuss in a follow-on episode, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on that.